This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
In so many histories of African Americans in the United States, the focus is very often on the history of slavery and the history of the civil rights. Very often there is not a lot of focus on the history of the Jim Crow South. Today we're joined by two scholars, Leslie Brown, Associate Professor of History at Williams College in Massachusetts, who was a researcher on the project Behind the Veil, documenting the African American experience in the Jim Crow South, which has just been digitized at the Center of Documentary Studies here at Duke University. And the Ohio State University Professor of English, Koritha Mitchell, whose new book, Living with Lynching, discusses the staging of lynching in African American plays and drama from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Welcome back to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Leslie Brown, Associate Professor of History at Williams College. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And we're talking today about this extraordinary project that is now out there in the world thanks to the Center of Documentary Studies here at Duke University. You were involved in the early stages of Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South. Thanks for joining us to talk about the project and your involvement with it. Can you go back to the early 1990s, mid 1990s when the project started to talk about, you know, what the hope was with Behind the Veil?
Oh, sure. Actually, the project started in the late 1980s with a group of young faculty who were in residence at both Duke and UNC. Elsa Barkley Brown, Robin Kelly, Robert Korstad, Jackie Hall, Bill Chafe, Ray Gavins, and a group of what are now well-known historians started talking about how, on the one hand, we knew a lot about slavery, and on the other hand, we knew a lot about, or were beginning to know a lot about the civil rights movement, but what of that era in between? And it's a generation of people who were dying. They were my grandparents' age and my parents' age, and the idea of using documentary studies, using oral history, to ask them the questions that we have about that time period. What better way to find out about what Black life was like than to ask those who experienced it? And so the project started as with great enthusiasm, a series of conferences, a series of curriculum initiatives, and then the field work, which began in the summer of 1993.
Talk a little bit about the field work. I mean, it must be extraordinary, first of all, having the time to sit down and do this kind of ethnographic work, to collect these oral histories. What were some of the responses, and of course we have access to what they actually said, but what were some of their responses to the fact that folks were kind of probing them, you know, for their memories about what it was like, you know, surviving, you know, the Jim Crow South?
Well, it's not a good analogy to think of what it would have been like for freed people to talk to those who were curious about slavery in the 1930s. But here we go in the 1990s to ask about the 1930s and 40s, to ask about the 1920s. And we talked to some people who were 100 years old, so, you know, who remembered the 19th century. And they were enthusiastic really about doing it. They had so much to say. Some of our interviews went an hour and a half, 2 hours long. And they wanted to be able to tell a story that they think we have forgotten, not just my generation, but the generation or two that are younger than me, that they've forgotten just how bad it was, just how terrible white people could be, and just how strong African Americans were. They talked about some core values that we think are lost, but I don't really think they're lost. And they were... some of the interviews were painful. People told about lynchings that they knew of. People told about being insulted, about their humiliations, the daily humiliations. But they also talked about faith and hope and determination and a desire to see things change and a hope that things would be different for the next generation and the next generation. And so to see things change over their time, they were happy to talk about that as well.
We're here with Professor Leslie Brown, who's an associate professor of history at Williams College in Massachusetts. She was a researcher on the wonderful project Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South, which is coming out of the Center of Documentary Studies here at Duke University. Talk a little bit about the value of this project. I mean, one of the things I'm really excited about is that the project now that has been digitized, and anybody in the world can go to iTunes University and download, some of these oral histories.
Yeah.
And so, myself, just personally, I'm looking forward to sitting down with my oldest daughter, who's 13, and spending some quality time with her, listening and talking about this. Talk about the value of this project at this particular historical moment, first Black president, but everything else that's going on.
Well, there are great lessons for us as African Americans in this collection. Great warnings about what's likely to occur as African Americans gain more access to the opportunities of American life. This is what the elders expected would happen, but they also tell us to expect trouble. and they give us examples even when we were collecting in the 1990s of things that they saw. The kind of pressure that Bill Clinton got really was a precursor to the kind of pressure that Barack Obama is getting now. And I don't think that they would be surprised by any of it.
One of the things I think that's really interesting about thinking about this transition, particularly to digital, is that it is making it accessible to young folks, right? Making history accessible, and particularly these narratives accessible. Were there any things, involved in your research and having heard all of these? Was there anything that surprised you? Any stories that caught you off guard and really surprised you?
The deep memories of pride, the deep memories of community surprised me. Sometimes it sounded like people wanted to go back to the Jim Crow era, although that's not what they were saying. They were talking about the strength of community and strength of family that they found personally, even as they realized it didn't work for everyone. I'm also very excited about this project being available digitally, which does mean anyone with access to the internet can hear these stories. But our elders would also remind us that not everyone has access to these stories, and still it's the privileged who will be able to take advantage of this history, and those who don't have access won't hear the stories. That is African American history in some ways, and it's saddening, and as much as it makes me happy to see it open.
What can you say? There has clearly been a fascination in the culture. We talked earlier with Koritha Mitchell, who is a professor of English at Ohio State. She's just written a wonderful book about the staging of lynching plays by African Americans in the early 20th century. And of course, we've seen very popular and well-known photo exhibits that have depicted lynching in American society, and of course we can take a project like Behind the Veil. What do you say about this almost fascination about this particular historical moment in our culture, and not just from the standpoint of African Americans needing to connect with our elders and our ancestors about how they survived America, but also kind of white America, being fascinated with this history?
Well, I think white America is fascinated with this history because it has in many ways been an invisible history. When I teach my classes, for example, my students don't seem to know that there was such a thing as Jim Crow, other than in myth or on television or signs. But the kind of everyday life, the everyday struggle, that there would be struggle, that there was expectation that there would be struggle, is relatively new to my white students. And they are horrified by what they hear. And in some ways, I wonder if the fascination with the past in this way if it reflects the questions that we have about the core truths of American society, that democracy really never did exist. So once we say that, then what what are our expectations? For example, with the upcoming election, why is it that Barack Obama, who moves to the center and then to the right, still can't seem to satisfy a group of people? These are stories that are these are situations that are anticipated in the stories that are told by
timeless, right?
behind
In
veiled
some ways, right? Yeah. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Leslie Brown, who's an associate professor of history at Williams College. She was a researcher on the wonderful new project that has been newly digitized, Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Professor Brown.
That was my pleasure. I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you.
This government is changing, and you can see what they are asking for and everything. And they say, give it back to this and give it back to that and give it back. But when they would change it all around, it would be back just like it was. But what would be bad, it would be so much worse. Because even for me, I have seen another side of life. And what was that I accept before, it would be hard for me to do that because at that time I did not know any better. See, I didn't see the brighter day. They just told you about the brighter day. I say that. I couldn't see going to Chicago and I've traveled a lot, lots of places. I couldn't see that. It would be very uncomfortable for me now if it went back to where it once was. Because it would be miserable. Because if it went back like, well, you still wouldn't have any protection, would you? You wouldn't have anything, and you speak up, you just be in the world's of trouble all the time. But the catch is, if it turns this time, it's going to be all over. See, it's starting up at the upper now. Now it's coming all the way down. And it's going to be, it's not going to be easy because people will die now. People that never thought of dying for something, they will die now before they do it. Because you got a whole generation of people here don't know nothing about what I'm talking about. So you see, they're not going to lay down for it. And the generation that lived through it is not going to accept it. So it's going to be very hard. But I can see Mr. Newt Gingrich and a whole lot of them. They added daily. They want to change all the amendments. They want to do everything that have stood for all these years. And they think people, I really don't know seeing, you can see all these other people now just coming up out of the woodwork. What good is it to have all of these militias and all of this stuff? Everybody's so cruel-minded now. See, we used to thought that people were cruel and different other stuff, but we got people now is just as cruel-minded as those people is. And you would have a harder time surviving, and we did.
Good afternoon and welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Koritha Mitchell, Associate Professor of English at The Ohio State University and the author of the new book, Living with Lynching, African American Lynching Plays, Performance and Citizenship, 1890 to 1930, published by the University of Illinois Press from their fabulous series, the New Black Studies series, edited by Darlene Clark Hine and Dwight McBride. How are you doing this afternoon, Koritha?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Talk a little bit about this book. There's been a lot of interest really over the last 2 decades about lynching in American society. There have been some really foundational photographic exhibits There have been collections of oral histories around this period of time. You've taken a very different tack. You're looking at a generation of Black authors, Black dramatists, who have developed a genre of literature, of stage drama around lynching. And you know, you're very clear, this isn't anti-lynching drama, but this is lynching drama. Talk a little bit about this work that gets produced, you know, in this period in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
Yes, you're exactly right. There's been so much attention to lynching, partly because of the Without Sanctuary exhibition, which has captured just so much attention, and understandably so. But as you know, part of what's interesting to me is that we don't get the voices of targeted communities when we look at those photographs, and we don't even get their perspectives, really, right? For the cameraman to do his job, he had to have a certain amount of safety in this situation. So when I studied the period, I was really interested in, you know, what are people who are surviving this? How are they coping with it? And I really wanted to hear their voices. And it turns out that a lot of them use drama to articulate something that we haven't heard from a lot of the other sources that everyone's looking at as they look at lynching in our history.
And you're very clear. Very often when we think about art of this nature, we're always, our desire is to always label it as protest art. And you're arguing that there's something very different that's taking place here. You know, this is really about folks trying to find ways to sustain themselves amongst this violence, amongst this trauma. You know, so the look is not so much at the white mobs on the outside, but really directed internally, right, to what's happening in terms of the Black domestic space, in terms of Black families and Black communities. Why do you think we always have this desire to think about Black art as always being solely focused on changing the ideas and opinions and perceptions of white folks, as opposed to really being a mechanism for us to deal with the realities of our trauma?
Yeah, it's such a great question. You know, that's actually been my big question too. Why are scholars so determined to label everything protest? It seems to me that a big part of it for this time period is that we came to understand this time period as the nadir of race relations, right? And so it's like, okay, so for so long we believed that Black people were just trying to survive during this time. They didn't have time for artistic contributions. And so work by people like Barbara McCaskill and Caroline Gebhard, you know, trying to think in terms of post-bellum pre-Harlem, that this isn't simply the progressive era. It's not simply the nadir of race relations. It's actually a post-bellum pre-Harlem era. And that seems like a more fluid category. And that's part of how I got to the point where I could see beyond this idea of protest, see beyond this idea that we're just getting by, but in fact, we're actually sustaining each other. And part of what eventually happened is I started to see what the plays were actually telling us, which is precisely that, you know, lynching is actually a response to what we're doing. We're not responding to lynching so much as the mob is responding to our successes. The mob is responding to our efforts at self-affirmation. They want to squash those efforts. And when we really create the space to listen to what the playwrights themselves are saying as they're living in the midst of this violence, that's the strongest message that ends up coming through. And so that's what made me realize we need a different framework. We can't use protest when Alice Dunbar Nelson, for example, is saying so clearly it's our success that beckons the mob.
You know, you mentioned the fact that, you know, for many whites who engage in this mob violence, they saw lynching as a form of exorcism, right? They were ridding the world and the society of evil, and for them that evil was tethered to this notion of Black achievement, right? Black advancement, that there was something in their mind unnatural about the social order, you know, because Black folks were in fact moving forward and achieving some semblance of respectability in that context.
Absolutely. And Du Bois is one of the people who's really clear on this point, right? He says, well, you know, it's not Black criminality that scares you. It's actually Black success. So Blacks who were living during this time saw that. They recognized that. But of course, they also recognized just how much whites were able to, because of their power, skew the narrative and make it into this idea that, yes, this is an evil we have to get rid of, an evil that's threatening our safety, when in fact, it's just an evil that it's really just success success that's threatening oppression, that's threatening their repression. So yeah, but of course they had the power to skew the narrative.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, your host. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Koritha Mitchell, Associate Professor of English at The Ohio State University, and congratulations on your new coach. That's a bit of a sidebar here. Professor Mitchell is the author of the new book, Living with Lynching, African American Lynching Plays, Performance and Citizenship, 1890 to 1930. You make the point in the book that, you know, on one level, the stage has emerged as this kind of new site for an articulation of American identity. And so African American writers obviously would be concerned, if they're really concerned about managing images, right, in the society, challenging certain images, that they would be engaged in doing that kind of work also. But you make, you know, great points about the importance of using the one-act stage play in terms of its ability to really use a more efficient means, economical means, to be able to reach Black audiences. Talk about the development of one-act plays in the early 20th century for Black writers.
Yes. Oh, I love how much you get the argument. This is really exciting. Yes, absolutely. So increasingly in this time period, mainstream authors and critics and philosophers are talking about how it's important to begin using the stage to articulate what is distinctive about American identity. Novels, poems had done that kind of work. Now it's time to use the stage to do precisely that. And so in this time period, you see more and more of an investment in stage realism and that kind of thing. But what theater historians haven't paid as much attention to is how linked that investment in realism, so-called realism on the mainstream stage, is also happening at the exact same time that this repressive violence against Blacks is happening. So it seems to me that part of what Black playwrights' investment in drama as a form, part of their investment comes from realizing how important the mainstream stage has become, but also seeing how much its conventions lend to further denying their citizenship. And so it's important to take up drama, these playwrights seem to say, but it's also important to seize a different kind of space, that I'm not necessarily going to focus on getting on the mainstream stage to change your mind, but I am going to use the spaces that I can control to do theatrical work. So the one-act play is really, for me, the way that they seize that kind of control. Because one-acts are going to be published in periodicals such as the NAACP's Crisis and the Urban League's Opportunity, it's available for people who are just, you know, having conversation in the barbershop or in the beauty salon or at church. And so in that way, having the text in full that people can act out or just do dramatic readings, that ends up being a way for them to do dramatic or theatrical work while in spaces that they can control and in spaces that are relatively safe, rather than going to the mainstream stage, so they can focus on their living room, their church, their school.
And you mentioned how important it was, right? It really encourages a kind of communal literacy. Right, you know, the idea of a kind of group read, you know, in ways that, you know, we don't necessarily see anymore, right? In terms of, you know, we hear this idea of kind of book clubs, but you're really talking about something that's really even beyond that. And also in talking about the one-act play, the fact that these were plays that could be staged in someone's house or in a church, right, which encouraged a certain kind of intimacy about them. Or really, as you mentioned, deliberate choice not to make money, right? Because on the one hand, you know, this move towards one-act dramas is also a response to the popularity of the musical stage, particularly musical comedies, that has literally created the first generation of Black crossover stars in folks like George Walker and Burt Williams. And so you could see how kind of attractive and enticing that move might have been for playwrights, but they choose a very different tact in that regard.
Yes, and I love that you bring up Williams and Walker, and also Cole and Johnson would be the other famous Black musical comedy pair at the time. Part of what I find so
Ada Overton Walker, George Walker's wife,
yes.
Right.
Exactly. And part of what I find so intriguing is that, you know, at the height of their success, Williams and Walker, Cole and Johnson, their names are actually called out by New York City rioters
Right,
who are saying,
1899,
let's go
yeah.
out and kill them. And so it seems to me that part of what the one-act playwrights are doing is that they're acknowledging that despite that level of success, racial violence is always just right on the rim, always part of the experience. And how can we tell that truth for ourselves, it seems to me.
You're watching Left of Black, and we're here this afternoon with Professor Koritha Mitchell, who's Associate Professor of English at The Ohio State University and the author of the brand new book, Living with Lynching, African American Lynching Plays, Performance, and Citizenship, 1890-1930. That's the University of Illinois Press. One of the things you talk about in the context of looking at some of these early one-act plays are some of the standard conventions that are used. There's the trope of Black domesticity, right? This really focus on Black home life, the idea of a virtuous Black womanhood, and also a responsible manhood. And I think these are all conventions that we see that go throughout the 20th century and even the 21st century in terms of the performance of Black respectability. But you also talk about this process in terms of the early conventions of these one-act stage plays of degeneration. And what kind of impact this phrase that you coined, degeneration, has on Black life. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, degeneration has struck me always as a really crucial contribution of this genre. The fact that these plays would so often feature a grandmother and grandchildren, but very rarely a husband-wife pair in the middle. So as much as they're invested in respectability, there's this constant highlighting of how that kind of nuclear family backbone is missing. So what they suggest is that that's precisely what is under attack. Again, it's not about being a criminal, it's not about being immoral, but if you fit the standard that the society says it values, that is when you come under attack. And so degeneration, I basically define it as generation removal or prevention. And so it can either be that that middle generation isn't represented at all in the text, which is true of most of the plays, certainly 4 of the 7 earliest plays by women. Or it can be that there is a couple, but their union isn't functioning in some way. So for example, in a play called Safe by Georgia Douglas Johnson, you have that happy family there, but the man of the house is actually avoiding a mob at the time that his wife goes into labor. And then when she gives birth to a boy, she strangles him to death, basically believing that he's going to be attacked by mobs anyway, so this is the only time I'll have to dictate what his life will be. Otherwise, if I let him grow up to be the kind of respectable man that I intend for him to be, then that's going to make him a target. So by presenting so consistently this attack of that middle generation, it seems to me that the plays are basically saying it doesn't matter if we're the perfect model of what the country says it wants, we are still going to be targeted. Yeah. They don't want our success.
And that whole degeneration frame, I mean, it's interesting because we see it reflected in a contemporary moment in response to things like drug addiction in the prison industrial complex, right? Where, in an everyday lived reality, right, we can mark these kind of missing generations. You know, how effectively that's been represented in contemporary Black art is another question, right? But it does speak to a certain kind of reality on the ground in Black communities.
Yeah, and if I could, thank you so much for making that connection, because part of what it seems to me degeneration is about is it's about marking a level of despair. It seems to me that only by believing that you are unjustly under siege can you mark that level of despair, right? With that example I just gave you from Safe. If there's any doubt in your mind that maybe that guy who just got lynched might have deserved it, you couldn't mark that level of despair. Yeah, so part of what seems important to me as we think about our contemporary moment, I'm really struck by the connections between my work and that of Michelle Alexander, who's actually here also in the law school at Ohio State, in her book, The New Jim Crow, because part of what I find so profound about the framework she gives us in that book is that she's interested in having us acknowledge the function of shame in our communities today. That if you have a Black man in your family who is on parole or has been in the system in any way, there's a certain kind of work, the culture is doing some work around shame that too many of us are taking on. And it seems to me that when you have a convention like Degeneration that basically says, no, the reason I can express this despair is because this is so utterly unjust, that's a certain kind of rejection of shame that I think we need to take lessons from. So the way that Michelle Alexander wants us to acknowledge how shame is affecting our maybe lack of action with the prison industrial complex, it seems to me that the playwrights are also operating in that same understanding that we have to find the ways to tell each other the truth about our situation so that it's not going to be, we won't be shamed into tolerating this.
To stay in the contemporary moment for a little bit, and you're watching Left to Black, I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Professor Koritha Mitchell, author of the new book, Living with Lynching, African American Lynching Plays, Performance, and Citizenship, 1890 to 1930. You quote Du Bois earlier on in the book, and of course he, always had these kind of pronouncements about what he thought about black art. But when he discusses black theater, he talks about black theater as being about us, by us, for us, and near us. How applicable do you think that is to contemporary black art generally, whether or not we're talking about the stage or film or even music or literature? And how do you fit someone like Tyler Perry into the context of this conversation? And not Tyler Perry, the movie maker, but Tyler Perry, who, first made his reputation on the musical stage.
Yeah. So interesting. Tyler Perry is interesting in lots of different ways for me. But, what I would say is I appreciate the distinction you're making, right, between his film work and his stage work, because I do think there is something about tapping into a black community and serving a black community base with his traveling theater work. I mean, my mom loves those plays, and that was the first time I was introduced to it because I went home and she had this, bootleg video of one. And I was like, okay, what's up with this? So yeah, I think you're right that there is a way in which his stage work is more about the community. And so in that way, I think there's no denying the power of what he does. Now, my politics aren't quite as conservative as his. I think that there is something, even in those stage plays, in terms of a real investment in propriety that always is about individual choices. Right. I rarely see anything from him that is about the structures and the history. It's always that if you make the right choice as an individual, you're going to be okay. So from that standpoint, even his stage work, I find troubling for that reason. But there's no denying that it's like going to church. And so then in that way, James Baldwin would say, this is the height of theater. He says often in his work, there's no better drama than the drama of the church. And so in that way, Tyler Perry's theater work really captures a lot of what is unique about Black culture that I think can't be denied, as much as I'm not his biggest fan.
You've been watching Left to Black. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Koritha Mitchell, who's Associate Professor of English at The Ohio State University and the author of the new book, Living with Lynching, African American Lynching Plays, Performance, and Citizenship 1890 to 1930. That's published by the University of Illinois Press as part of their groundbreaking The New Black Studies series, as edited by the legendary Darlene Clark Hine and Dwight McBride. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Koritha.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.